Okay, I think it has started. Just a second. Okay. Yes. So we're starting to record the session. So thanks to our dear friend and colleague Professor Patricia Antaki. Patricia got her PhD at the University of Poitiers in France, and she's a medieval archaeologist. She is currently director of the Department of Archaeology and Museology at the University of Balamand in North Lebanon. Her research interests and publications are mostly related to the archaeology of the Crusader period in Lebanon and the Levantine region. These interests include studies of Frankish settlements, such as Beirut, Tyre, Enfe, Beaufort, fortifications examinations, again, such as Tyre city walls, the citadel of Beirut, the fortress of Beaufort, the sea castle of Sidon, the fortified harbors and fortified caves, as well as churches and monasteries investigations, the Cathedral of Tyre, the Holy Saviour Chapel of Tyre, the St. George Greek Orthodox Cathedral of Beirut, the chapels of Jebel and the Batroun Mountains. Her field of research also covers various aspects of the material culture of the Crusades, such as mason marks, sundials, acoustic jars, graffiti, oil lamps, and board games. She participated in a number of excavations, in particular an excavation at 4 different sites at Beirut, in the Tel area, and in the Greek Orthodox St. George Church. She studied the medieval fortress and the urban topography of the medieval Beirut. And lately, she started co-direction with the AUB Museum of the Excavations in Enfe, focusing in particular on the medieval defenses and oil presses. And in recent years, she started also co-director of the excavations in the medieval churches in Jebel and Batroun with a Lebanese-Hungarian team directing excavations in Jebel and the Batroun area and in Sinal Field in the Beirut suburbs. And I'm very happy also to say that very, very recently she started a cooperation with the Northern Lebanon project for the study of the medieval architectural evidence in the region of Kura. So I'm very, very happy, and thank again Patricia for her participation, and I'm very happy to leave the floor to her for her presentation about Beirut. Thank you very much, Patricia.
So can you see my screen?
Yes, very well.
Yes, okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Marco, for the nice introduction, and thank you all for being here. And I would like also to thank Arwa for giving me the opportunity to give this talk, which is a subject very dear to my heart, and that's the city of Beirut. So like so many people, so many of you, as I can see, and so many people around me, Beirut is the city where I was born, where I grew up, where I loved living, and I still do, despite the catastrophic situation that you know very well and that our country is going through. But unlike most people of Beirut, it's also the city where I have had the chance to dig as an archaeologist and to follow day after day and year after year the results of the large-scale excavations that have been going on for almost 3 decades now. Yeah, time flies. And which have unraveled the historical layers of Beirut and unveiled really its extraordinary wealth. In this respect, these investigations can be considered, as some have put it, one of the greatest archaeological adventures of the turn of the century. Now, I have chosen to address here the issue of the evolution of the city, which I consider a chief one. In order to achieve a better understanding of Beirut's urban transformation, I invite you, during this little hour, to follow the settlement's evolution from a small urban one to the major Middle Eastern metropolis it has become today, while going through all the periods that marked the place, that is, as you know, the Bronze Age period, the Iron Age, the Hellenistic, the Roman, Byzantine, medieval, and Ottoman periods. Of course, I will only speak of the archaeological periods. Scholars interested in the past of Beirut know only bits and pieces of it, but most of them still miss the overall broad picture. Indeed, although archaeological works have been carried out in the city since the French Mandate period, that is the 1920s, and although they have resumed after the Civil War, starting 1993, when it was decided to rebuild, as you know, the whole downtown area, or as it was called, the BCD, the Beirut Central District, by both Lebanese and foreign teams, under the supervision, of course, of the Directorate General of Antiquities, we can mention only 3 serious attempts to retrace the evolution of the city. So to my knowledge, but I might miss somebody, this topic was tackled only by Dutch archaeologist Hans Curvers, by French coordinator for UNESCO in Beirut, Philippe Marquis, and by Lebanese archaeologist and colleague and friend Georges El Heibe. Now, in order to conduct my research, although an overwhelming bulk of archaeological documentation, as you can guess, has been collected, especially since the 3 last decades of extensive rescue excavations, I could only take into account the material that has been published, bearing in mind that most of the results yielded by the investigated sites, that is, as you can see, the impressive number of 200 or even more ones within downtown only, thus covering about 9 hectares of the city center, have not been published yet. And those which have been a handful of sites only are still in most cases not fully presented, as only preliminary reports have been made public so far. So before delving into the history of Beirut, it's important to understand the location and the topography of the area for those who are not familiar with it. So, as you know, Beirut is located on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean coast. It lies in the middle of the actual Lebanese shoreline at the foot of the Mount Lebanon range, which runs parallel to the coast. South of the original settlement, which corresponds to the actual downtown area, can be found the Cape of Ras Beirut, that you see here, which provides the town a protection from the prevailing winds, which are southwestern winds. And along the shore, the presence of several coves and bays are attested to have served as mooring places, and some still do. We still have the small fisherman harbor, for example, in Ras Beirut. The main basin, however, here is the one which was located between Ras el-Shamiyeh, where's my pointer? Here, and the castle cliffs, the castle which was built in the medieval period. So here you have this natural bay, which is, for those who know the place, roughly located between Foch and Alempi streets. And it is here that the first harbor originated and developed until the modern port was built at the end of the 19th century. So the harbor is really the key feature in the history of the town. Terrestrial access to the town was possible from 2 sides, either from the eastern side, or I realize, no, the north is here, okay. So either from the eastern coastal road, that is from the northern cities of Jbeil or Byblos and Tripoli, through the bridge of the river of Beirut, which is here, or the second access is from the southern side, through a 3-kilometer corridor, or a depression which lies between the 2 promontories that you see here. The Ras Beirut one to the west, with an altitude of about 95 meters above sea level, made of Cretaceous compact limestone, for those who like geology, and to the east, the Ashrafiyeh Hills made of Miocene marly limestone, with almost the same altitude, that is about 100 meters above sea level. Now, this second axis, the southern one, linked the city southwards to Sidon and Tyre and Palestine, and eastwards to the mountainous hinterland and to the Bekaa Valley, and from there to the city of Damascus. And this connection with the eastern area was one of the main assets of Beirut compared to the other coastal cities. Alluvial deposits originating from both promontories gave rise to several springs in the southern corridor, such as the spring of Ras al-Naba, still operational today and from which I still bring water today. And these deposits also gave rise to streams which flew down to the town at the foot of the Tell. So you see at the bottom left, you can see the Tell area. So that's downtown. You have the Tell and the Sarai Hill. So you have here on the Tell area is an outcrop that overlooks the sea on the northeastern angle of the city, which became an important landmark, as we will see. And the second hill, as I said, is the Sarai Hill, that's the Kantari Hill, on the western side of downtown, which is the northernmost tip of Ras Beirut promontory, and which is occupied today by the Grand Sarai, that's the headquarters of the Lebanese Prime Minister. So to sum up, Beirut lay in a favorable area, well protected from the winds, in an accessible place between two promontories. It was well furnished with water and was endowed with a harbor basin, which will play a paramount role over the centuries in its maritime trade identity and will even define its urban history. So before observing the birth of the first town, it should be noted that many prehistoric traces composed mainly of flint tools, as you can see, from the Middle and Upper Paleolithic and the Neolithic periods have been attested on several spots, both in downtown and in the surrounding area and in what is known today as larger Beirut. So within the town itself, that's the actual downtown area, several scattered sites have yielded prehistoric flints and pottery sherds from the Neolithic period also. So in the neighborhood, prehistoric remains have been located on the banks of Nahar Beirut, that's the river of Beirut, and further north in the famous cave of Antelias and Xara'il, and a high concentration of these remains was unearthed also south of the city in the so-called corridor, that's the fertile, accessible, and well-watered area. In places such as Bshar el-Khouri, but also in Firn el-Shabbik, Al-Uri Sam'an, or Hari Tahrik. So in addition, west of the town in Ras Beirut, especially in the so-called area of the sands of Beirut, Les Sables de Beirut, no less than 20 sites have been recorded, among which are flint knapping sites like the one you can see found next to Pigeon's Rock on the site known as Minet el-Dalia. So as you can see, human activity illustrated by the remains of hunter-gatherers had already started in the area since the most remote times. Now, the first urban settlement, however, of course, does not emerge as expected before the Bronze Age period. But let's have a look at the literary record first. So the Bronze Age city of Beirut, or to be more precise, the late Bronze Age city, is known in the written text under the name of Biruta, which in the Semitic language is the plural for bir, which is still the name we use to speak of water wells, because bir is water well. So this comes as no surprise, since, as I said earlier, the soil of Beirut is composed of a sediments layer, which covers a shallow water table. And this vital resource was wisely taken advantage of by the inhabitants, as revealed by the numerous water wells that were dug over the centuries and scattered really all over the whole excavated area. And the oldest of these wells, dating back to the Middle Bronze Age, which we found actually on the Tell area. So, returning to the text, Biruta, very quickly, of course. Biruta is referred to in several letters of the famous 14th century Egyptian correspondence, the Amarna correspondence between the Canaanite kings and the pharaohs. The name of Biruti also appears a century later in letters from Ugarit. So what do these texts tell us? They inform us basically about the name of two Beiruti kings, Amunira and Yapahada, and they reveal that Beirut was one of the main kingdoms of the Canaanite coast, although not a major one like Byblos, And we learn also from these texts about alliances established against the northern Amurru kingdom, an Egyptian rival, as well as the rivalry between Beirut and Byblos. So what's the evidence of the first city that we have uncovered on the ground? So this will recall lots of memories to some of the people attending, I think. So first, the boundaries. Several ramparts belonging to several Bronze Age phases were brought to light on the so-called Tel area that I have already mentioned. Now, if you remember, this Tel is located at the northwestern angle of downtown, and it's a small limestone eroded outcrop with a steep northern face overlooking the sea, today partly demolished, and a slightly sloping south face. It covers a surface of about 20,000 square meters, and this is really roughly the surface of the first Bronze Age town of Beirut, and what will become later the Acropolis of the city. Now, the first and oldest defensive wall is an Middle Bronze Period east-west wall, so that's number 2 here. To which was added a glacis, that's number 3, if you can see my pointer. So the glacis, we'll talk a lot about glacis here. So it's this sloping wall. So this first Middle Bronze glacis was made of clay. Now, some 13 meters southwards, the town grew slightly bigger during the same period, and a second wall was added, a better preserved one, up to a height of 6 meters and reinforced at regular intervals by pilasters. A major discovery consisted in the uncovering of one of the gateways that you can see here, leading up to the town, which is a 2-meter entrance flanked by 2 piers continuing into a wider staircase. Subsequently, an additional L-shaped wall that you see here was built, transforming the entrance into a bent axis one, chicane entrance, as we used to call it, obviously making its access more difficult. In the late Bronze period, a stone glacis, and that would be number 6 here, a stone glacis is, so made of pebbles and rubble, blocked the entrance, obviously as a new fortification wall was built on top of it, since the glacis is really the base of the fortification. That's what we're looking at. So as these massive walls were found on several sites, the occupied Bronze Age settlement surface could thus be calculated and estimated to about the surface of the Tel, which is about 200 meters in length and more or less 100 meters in width. That's around 2 hectares. These dimensions correspond to a modest town of this period, very modest town, really. Parallels that can be mentioned are the early Bronze Age cities of Jericho and Megiddo to the south, and the Bronze Age city of Byblos, just to give you an idea, for example, covered an area of 5 hectares. So we can explain the choice of this place by its elevated situation overlooking the rest of the plain on one side and the sea on the other, as well as probably the harbor located to the east, maybe one to the east and another one, the main one, to the west of the protruding cliff. This choice can also maybe be explained by the presence of a probable watercourse or a talweg flowing at its foot, so you can see it here down there on the western side and leading to the harbor. What you can see here are the boreholes that were made during a geophysical survey to attest the extension and the existence of the harbor at this place. Within this fortified area, I'm sorry for the quality of the pictures. I only had photocopies. So we have uncovered only 2 dwellings. These were made of walls, as you can see, with stone foundations, topped with mud brick walls, and associated with mud-beaten floors filled with material, the earliest dating back to the early Bronze IV period that you can see here, characterized by the combed surface. I'm glad Hanan is here. She will correct me if I'm wrong. So several tombs were also found on the Tell. 5 were shafts cut in the rock from the Middle and Late Bronze Age phases with an interesting material consisting of imported objects from Egypt, a clear evidence, of course, of trade and confirming this relationship attested in the literary sources. And one tomb consisted of a Middle Bronze funerary jar in which we found a small 3-year-old girl. Now, outside the Tell, very scant Bronze Age remains were documented. They, however, are evidence of the existence of the occupation of a lower town, as you can see here. So that's the Tell, that's the lower town. Probably an occupation by peasants cultivating the surrounding arable lands and living in kind of hamlets. So I will not give maybe the names of all the sites, well, for those who wish, but I don't know who's familiar with them. Bay 101, Bay 105, 027, 023, and some others too. And we also have some flint tools found in these Bronze Age locations. So moving to the Iron Age periods, the city of Beirut is surprisingly mentioned only once in the 7th century in the so-called Esarhaddon prism found in Nineveh. In this text, the Assyrian monarch lists the conquered cities which were dependencies of Sidon, seemingly. The archaeological remains that have been uncovered for 30 years now clearly point to the existence of a Phoenician and Persian, so that's the Persian Achaemenid city, but I will refer to it as Persian for sake of commodity, on the Tell area, serving as the Acropolis and an occupation of the lower town, much more important than the precedent one. So a modest settlement, thus echoing really the dearth of the literary documentation, but clearly attested and mainly developing in the neighborhood of the harbor. So on the Acropolis, the stronghold was again limited by a sequence of defensive walls encompassing more or less the main surface area than the Bronze Age town. So the first of these enclosures is the famous huge glacis, that's number 7 that you can see here and on the image here. So it's a glacis with a slope of 33 degrees, which was built during the Iron Age 1 period or possibly during the Late Bronze Age, immediately south of the former one, as you can see, and in use into the 8th century BC. The second defensive wall was built in the 7th century and consisted of a casemate wall comprising no less than 7 rooms serving as warehouse. So that's the casemate wall that you can see here. You can see the rooms, and in one of the rooms we found a complete amphorae. So, and the last one is the third Iron Age 3 period, or what we call Persian period, is a linear wall, that's this wall, running at the foot of the latter glacis and parallel to it. We also found 2 of the entrances in the glacis. The first eastern one is a staircase that you can see here, which led to one of the city gates and which was endowed with a guard room. The second western one is a ramp, which led from a lower gatehouse to a gate complex, which was not found, but was hinted at by the material. So excavations have shown that many repairs also were carried out on all 3 walls. Besides these defenses, no Phoenician structures were found on the Tell itself due to the destruction caused by modern building activities. A settlement was established apparently around the harbor. Here. As evidenced by a large quarter west of it, seemingly of both residential and commercial characters, and by numerous vestiges belonging to dwellings from the Iron Age and mostly from the Iron Age 3 period that have been found on several sites. All aligned along a regular network of orthogonal streets, which in some cases were long and narrow blocks of houses. On another note, it must be mentioned that a portion of the harbor quay was found also, and the numerous importations recorded in the uncovered material, mainly from Cyprus and the Aegean coast, hint to a bustling trade activity. And finally, several tombs and cemeteries belonging to this period have also been uncovered close to the Tell and farther away. These are from east to west. So here on the plan, one grave from the Persian period found in the eastern Saifi area, two cemeteries which are not mentioned here, were located directly on top of the glacis, and that's strange enough, I think, on top of the entrances already mentioned, when these obviously fell into disuse. The first to the east is a somehow peculiar cemetery because they found in it not humans, but dogs. They found at least 10 dogs from the Persian period. There's a similar and much larger one, which was recorded in Ascalon. And the second burial on top of the glacis, the western one, consists of 10 human pit burials. Other burials were found south of the Tell, as you can see on the plan, namely in Martyr Square and under the Sarai Mosque. Another one from the 12th century BC that you can see here to the right was found west of the harbor and included a bone amulet with the cartouche of Pharaoh Ramses IV. Still farther west, along the coastline, a cemetery extended over a distance of more than 600 meters, thus reaching the modern-day hotels district. If we set aside the burials found on top of the glacis, all the others can be considered as lying at the fringes of the settlement, which was the traditional Phoenician scheme in which the settlement and the funerary space were separated from each other. So we have seen how the urban occupation spread outward beyond the settlement mound. Beirut thus fits well into the picture of a typical Phoenician settlement, composed usually of two districts, when the topography allowed it, of course, the upper city serving as a citadel, which accommodated the administrative buildings, major temples, and wealthy residences, and the lower town, which housed the population dwellings and business zone. Nonetheless, Beirut still remained a small town, similarly to cities like Sarepta or Tel Kaisan. So, the subsequent Hellenistic period, inaugurated, so to speak, by King Alexander the Great, followed after his death by the rule of the Ptolemies and later that of the Seleucids, can be divided into 4 phases as far as the political situation of the city and urbanization are concerned. The first phase follows the Macedonian conquest and is attested by an urban expansion revealed by the building activity, coin studies, and ceramic analyses. The second phase is a period of recession, which corresponds to the period under the Ptolemies, during which Beirut was still dependent on Sidon. The third phase, about 200 BC, witnesses a revival period under the subsequent Seleucid period, where the city probably gained its independence. And finally, the fourth phase follows the destruction of the city in 143 by Diodotus Tryphon, and Laodicea in Canaan, or Laodicea in Phoenicia as it was then called, seems to have lost its importance, as hinted at by the very little attested building activity and by the coins analysis once more. So what is the aspect of the city at that time? Well, let's say that it underwent a complete change, or rather that the urban growth already witnessed in the Iron Age period continues on a much larger scale and expanded, as you can see, considerably in all directions. The Acropolis, so the ancient Tell, was probably still in use and was further fortified with a casemate wall, but the main city now extended as far south as the Emir Bashir Street, here, as far east as the Georges Haddad Boulevard, with a semicircular tower that you can see here, which was built during 2 phases at each angle of the eastern city wall. So you have a tower here, another here, and other towers that were found here along its track. And the city expanded as far west as probably the foot of the Grand Serai Hill. So except for the western putative wall, the foundations of these defenses were all uncovered, though partially. Inside the city, the occupation was rather dense and quite elaborate, as it was arranged into insulae or rectangular blocks along regular patterns of streets. The settlement was led in places over the precedent Persian one, following the ancient orthogonal grid, as we said, but in most cases, the occupation levels were recorded directly on bedrock. Some dwellings seem to have had at least one upper floor, and some were even decorated with very nice wall paintings, as you can see this restitution to the right. So here you have the example of one of the residential quarters. This one was the one dug by the French mission. And you can see in yellow the Hellenistic rooms, which come on top of some orange Persian walls. And the blue ones are, the blue structures are the ones from the Roman and mostly Byzantine period. So they all followed the same, more or less the same pattern. So it's interesting also to know the existence of a possible temple dedicated to Astarte or Aphrodite, located at the intersection between Vegan and Foch streets. To the west, excavations have revealed a quarry zone, and finally, extramuros, especially to the west, lay the cemeteries occupying in several places the ancient Persian ones. Right, so what happens now during the Roman period in Beirut? Okay, let's start just by having a quick look at this very nice commercial weight that features, if you know, the ritual foundation of a city, and that is the plowing of the sacred track by the founder of the colony. That's called, I don't know if I pronounce it well, Sulcus Primigenius. So, as you know, the whole region is brought under Roman control and turned into the Syrian province by General Pompey in 64 BC. And in 14 BC, Beirut was granted by Emperor Augustus with the prestigious title of Colonia Julia Augusta Felix Berytus. And it will enjoy, furthermore, the jus italicum, that is the exemption from imperial taxes. Now, Augustus also established in the city the veterans of two legions, the 5th Macedonian and the 3rd Gallic, who must have definitely boosted the development of the city. The texts also record large building projects taking place in the city by Herod the Great, Agrippa I, Agrippa II, and Queen Berenice, as stated by an inscription. Berytus also became famous for its law school, which stood prominent among those of greater cities, hence its attribute as Nutrix Legum, or mother of laws. In light of all this literary evidence, it can be stated that the city was by all means a very prosperous and magnificent one, with a population estimated to about 50,000. Its territory even stretched as far as Baalbek and even as far as the Orontes river sources. So how does this reflect on the ground in terms of urban development? Compared to the Hellenistic settlement, the town grew even larger with the same, as you can see, with the same northern sea limit, of course, same eastern limit delineated by a city wall with round towers. Okay, but with a southern extension of a length of 170 meters, as attested on two sites located on the Fuad al-Shab Avenue, and a probable extension to the west, as many remains of that period were found in that area, mainly a hippodrome and several luxurious decorated villas. So unless this western settlement belonged to an extramural urban development, as it is the case on the eastern side, where an important suburb with temples, baths, and latrinas has been recorded immediately east of the city here, immediately east of the city entrance, delimited also, I don't know if you can see them, by two towers at the end of Gouraud Street. That's amazing. So the layout of the city is marked by large colonnaded thoroughfares erected in the 2nd century, the main north-south axis, or Cardo Maximus, recorded on various sites, which runs down to the harbor, which is the main focal point of the city, and an east-west decumanus maximus established on top of the former southern Hellenistic boundary, and at least one secondary decumanus, which I have not represented here, with a possible main decumanus here in Vegan Street, but it's still subject to debate. So the city was provided, as we said, with public monuments. The major ones that were uncovered are a forum in the city center. So that's the ancient plan established by Jean Loffret, who was the engineer supervising and conducting excavations in that period. So he established for the first time the Roman layout of the city. So you have the forum here, and this is a very nicely decorated niche from one of the walls of the forum. And it was something like 220 meters long. And maybe there was another forum here to the east. What was also found were 6 large baths with a monumental aqueduct still standing in the nearby mountains and supplying water to the city, an infeum, 2 or 3 possible temples, and a hippodrome in Wadi Abu Jmil area with estimated dimensions of 300 by 92 meters, and adjoining it, as you can see, a theater and other annexes. As for the civil basilica identified by Loffret, I'm sorry, I'm going backwards, which is here, it has been recently interpreted as part of the imperial baths. And as for the celebrated law school premises, which are supposed to lie in the church's area, their remains still haven't been unequivocally located yet. So this is another layout of the Roman period that was drawn by archaeologist Hans Curvers, which is a bit different and enriched compared to Jean Loffret's plan. A dense network of dwellings and shops followed in most cases the ancient Hellenistic grid. A greater wealth among the residents is suggested by the presence of peristyles, private baths and basins, rooms furnished with mosaic pavements, especially in the area west of the harbor, like the one you see here, which represents a Nilotic scene. So you have here what's left of a figure here, and you have the small puto engraving on the nilometer, the level of the Nile. So this was one of the common themes. So it's a very rich mosaic. And a greater wealth among the residents is suggested, as we said, by the presence of all these structures and decoration. And we even have a new style of compact courtyard house, which was also introduced at this time, probably to accommodate the colonists. So here you have an idea of what a residential quarter looked like, and you can see how dense the dwellings were. So on the harbor side, Roman engineers were also very active as they enlarged the western basin with concrete seawalls, and some industrial workshops are attested on the eastern outskirts of the city. These comprise mainly pottery and glass kilns. So here you can see the plan of one of the pottery workshops. And as usual, we end up with the funerary space, which at that time is an impressive and much extended one, as dozens and dozens really of burials and cemeteries were found all around the town at its direct fringes, as well as in more remote places such as the Ashrafiyya Hill to the southeast, modern-day St. George Hospital to the east, or Pigeon's Cave in Ras Beirut to the southwest. Here you have 2 nice examples of these burials, and their locations suggest that at its greater extent, metropolitan Beirut covered an area of at least 1.2 kilometers by 0.8 kilometers. So, in the late Roman period, also known as the Proto-Byzantine period, that we will refer to as Byzantine period for the sake of commodity again, the city is but a mere continuation of the previous Roman one, with a further additional luxury touch, so to speak. So here you can see the lovely house of the fountains that was found. to the left with very nice pavements and mosaics. The sources here again refer to a flourishing city which finds ample confirmation in the archaeological record, and the law school at that time was recognized by Justinian as one of the 3 law schools of the empire. New elements emerge, however, in the landscape of this henceforth Christian city, which acquired in 450 the illustrious title of metropolis, namely the religious buildings, of course. 4 or 5, I'm not sure, are attested in a text written by a law school student, Zacharias the Scholastic, the Anastasis, the Theotokos, and 2 martyria lying extramuros, whereas on the ground evidence for only 2 have been found. One, I'm not entitled to talk about, but I will just mention it. One is located in Riyadh al-Solah Square, unpublished yet, and the other one is suggested by the presence of its cemetery in the basement of the actual Greek Orthodox St. George Cathedral. And that would probably be the famous Anastasia Church, famous because we know from the text that it used to stand next to the law school, which location is the object of several debates. However, besides these new edifices, it does not seem that the Christianization of Beirut resulted in any shift of focus in the public space, as has been observed in other contemporaneous cities of this period, such as Antioch. Following a period of prosperity, the heyday of Beirut is brought to an end by a series of earthquakes, mainly by the final blow of the one of July 551, which completely devastated the city, killing about 30,000 people. The archaeological record has confirmed beyond doubt the effects of this calamity that hit the city. Indeed, the excavations have yielded in many areas destruction levels associated in places with fire traces also recorded in the contemporaneous account, like that of Malalas, who describes how fires burned and flared amongst the ruins for almost 2 months after the disaster. A large-scale abandonment of most of the urban area is also attested, such as in the souks area, which remained largely unoccupied afterwards. But in other areas, there is evidence for some activity, although on a smaller scale, thus corroborating the texts referring to the help which was sent by Emperor Justinian for the rebuilding of the place by dispatching a functionary, Martanius, for this task. The same Martanius that we find mentioned in an inscription. Even the tsunami, the tidal wave that accompanied the earthquake, which is also recorded by Malalas, was evidence in the harbor area deposits. As for the law school, it moved to Sidon in the aftermath of the earthquake. It is important to note that, as archaeologist Rana Mikati has explained, that Beirut never regained its former magnificence, at least during the end of the Byzantine period, which could have been logically expected, and likely that was due because of economic and political circumstances that did not encourage the urban revival. So Mikati also points out that the situation might have been somewhat different in the countryside, where people might have been encouraged to invest more in rural property, as she says, as can be hinted at from sites such as Khaldi, Shwaifat, Jnah, or Deir el-Alaim, Bet Mary, where a continuity in building activity is attested, including church building activity and oil production, which was very important. So now we enter in the medieval period, and the Lebanese Middle Ages, as you probably know, are a long period covering almost a millennium, stretching from the 7th century until the 16th century, starting in about 636 with the first Islamic phase, followed in the 12th and 13th century by the Crusader Ayyubid occupation, and ending with the Mamluk period. I can tell you already that compared to the precedent phases, we have very limited archaeological evidence from the city during these 3 periods, but this very dearth of the physical remains is itself informative of the city situation, which had obviously lost its former significant role. So we will begin with the Umayyads, Abbasids, and Fatimid dynasties, which occupied successively Beirut from the 7th until the 10th centuries. The texts of the 10th century chroniclers like Istakhri ibn Hawal and Muqaddasi all refer to a fortified maritime city. Therefore, it seems that a new enclosure wall was built at that time, as you can see, thus reducing the size of the town. And it is highly probable that this was the rampart which continued to be in use until the end of the 19th century and which appear on the first maps drawn in the 1830s and 1840s and in so many engravings. And therefore, we can calculate the surface area of the town, which measures 570 meters in length from north to south and 370 meters width from east to east, thus covering an area of approximately 21 hectares. A moat or a ditch was dug all around it, making the access to the walls even more difficult. A portion of this 6-meter wide feature has been found here, as you can see, on the western rampart along the western talweg or watercourse. It seems that the general urban grid was still in place, with some streets and alleys being cleared and repaved, as attested in a few places, whereas some were partially built over. So here you have two examples, one showing an Umayyad pottery, an Umayyad amphora on top of a broken mosaic. And here you can see in the souks area to the bottom left, an Abbasid pottery assemblage placed on the floor of one of the old Byzantine rooms. So memory of the past city glory must have still been visible in several places of the town, such as maybe an arch spanning a street at one of the entrances of Beirut, which was described by Persian traveler Nasser Khusro as, for the few dwellings that have been uncovered, they occupied, as I said, the former ones. Interestingly enough, the imperial baths west of the present Omari Mosque, the Romano-Byzantine baths, continued to be used, though in a reduced form, from the Umayyad until the Mamluk period. Finally, a cemetery has been found immediately outside the southwestern angle of the city, unpublished yet. In the following phase, when the Crusaders invaded the town in 1110, the city of Beirut, as it was then called, became part of a lordship belonging to the southern kingdom of Jerusalem. With its 21 hectares, the city can be considered as a modest one compared to the great centers of that time, such as Jerusalem, which measured 86 hectares, or Tyre, 48 hectares. The major contribution of the Crusaders was the construction of a fortress at the northeastern angle of the town on the raised ancient Acropolis, which provided an easy access both to the sea and to the surrounding countryside, which was a main consideration, you must admit, to take into account in these times of war. We know from the historical sources that the citadel existed already in 1184 and that it was further fortified in 1212 by Jean d'Ibelin, the ruler of the place. So this is part of the structure that was found, and this is here I have drawn the plan of the eastern tower, sorry, and the western tower. Here we found a postern and another postern here. So I'll go a bit quicker. Yes, so besides the citadel, the harbor was also well fortified and defended by two towers, as you can see, at its eastern entrance, still visible on the photographs and engravings of the 19th century. Other watchtowers like Burj al-Kashf to the southeastern angle of the city were scattered in the close neighborhood and in strategic points of the countryside. A major text, which is a confirmation of Pope Lucius III of the possessions of the Latin See of Beirut, provides us with ample information about the city. Now, among the listed monuments, of course, are the churches. A dozen of them are mentioned in this source, and 3 of them have been uncovered within its walls. The St. John Cathedral, the present-day Omari Mosque, the one under St. George's Greek Orthodox Church to the left, which has what's left of very nice frescoes, with its adjacent cemetery, and one excavated, the unidentified church south of Omari Mosque, decorated with mural paintings, which are now in the National Museum, and 2 other ones are located extramuros, the St. George, the actual Khudr Mosque, sorry, in the Karantina area, Mar Mkhayil, eastwards, and Mar Elias Ptina, St. Elias Church, lying in the southern suburb. We know also that the city was inhabited by both local people and foreign pilgrim and merchant communities from Genoa, Venice, Marseille, who were established mainly around the active harbor, where most of the activity, of course, took place. In addition, several industrial activities are mentioned, such as bakeries, one of which we found on St. George's site. The city also had workshops of lime, ceramics, glass, and iron. In fine, we can say that the Frankish city of Beirut appears as modest, but well defended, and as a commercial one with a good harbor which attracted many foreigners. What happens next is the arrival in 1291 of the Mamluks, who drove away the Crusaders and started by destroying the city walls, which seems, though, to have been quickly rebuilt. The same applies to the castle, which was demolished and then rebuilt as it continued to serve the garrison, as explained by the local Druze historian Saleh ibn Yahya. The few travelers visiting the city attest to the commercial activity which went on. The archaeological evidence is very meager. Besides the hammam still in use, a few industries are attested east of the city wall, such as glass and pottery workshops, and other industrial activity west of the port. At the very end of this period, in 1517, immediately outside the western ramparts of the city was erected this remarkable religious domed building, the only one still standing from the Mamluk period, the so-called Zawiyat ibn al-Agha al-Dimashqi, who was a Sufi scholar, and it was built next to another Zawiya, which does not exist anymore, that of Imam al-Uza'i, who lived in Beirut in the 8th century. Subsequently, we'll finish with this. During the long Ottoman period, which lasted until 1918, the inhabitants of Beirut remained for a large majority within its walls until the mid-19th century. Meanwhile, the Druze prince Fakhreddin II had rebuilt the city walls as well as a palace on the eastern side of the town. He is also known to have revived the silk industry, and thus, as you can see on the Royal Engineers map drawn in 1841, mulberry plantations surrounded the city and even occupied several urban areas, such as the souks area here, where a probable silk workshop was found. So what you see here are a series of basins. So it was interpreted as a silk workshop by the excavators. In 1773, Jazzar Pasha took possession of the city and rebuilt it, as well as he rebuilt a tower on top of the ruined citadel. And by the end of the century, the remains of this fortress were completely razed down during the modern harbor works. So the development of the harbor, which had started with Ibrahim Pasha in the 1830s, which quays have been identified and that you can see here, it was modernized. So the harbor was modernized in the 1880s, contributed in transforming the city from a provincial seacoast town of about 6,000 inhabitants to a cosmopolitan, commercial, political, and cultural hub, so more so that by the end of the 19th century, Beirut was again a thriving and flourishing city, eventually turning in 1920 into the capital of Lebanon. So you can see the evolution of the city from 1800 until today. So now that we have followed the 5 millennia of urban history and the diachronic evolution of the multi-layered city of Beirut, of its phases of development and decline, from its origins until the eve of its modern extension, let's briefly redraw the general lines of the stages of this process of incremental change. As explained, the first settlement started as a nucleus on the raised tell outcrop overlooking the harbor in the early Bronze Age and was already well defended in the Middle Bronze Age with very little evidence of the occupation of the lower suburbs. In the following Iron Age or Phoenician period, the landscape remains the same on the tell, with further fortifications erected south of the former ones, but already significant traces of a larger occupation are attested at the foot of the tell and around the harbor in the lower plain, especially at the end of this period, that is during the Iron Age III period or Persian period. The Hellenistic period, which follows the Macedonian conquest, is marked by a significant planned extension of the urban area in all three directions, materialized by the erection of a defensive wall circuit and by the establishment of a dense urban fabric and vast residential quarters overlying and using the previous Phoenician orthogonal layout. The subsequent Roman city, impressive, which had acquired the status of colony as a result of imperial policies, and the following Byzantine city are characterized by a further urban extension to the south and the relocation of the city center from the Tel area to the center of the new city. They are also marked by the development of the settled suburbs eastwards and possibly westwards, as well as an outstanding urban development in terms of monumentality and density, really, of the architectural remains, extravagant buildings and luxurious houses, and the wealth, of course, of the archaeological material. With the destructions posed by the 551 earthquake, this magnificent and prosperous city came to an abrupt end and was left in partial ruin, with patchy evidence for rebuilding and with only a modest settlement. As you can see, a pale shadow of the former city attested on its ruins during the first Islamic period. The city was further more marked by the reduction of the urban area and its demarcation by an enclosure wall that will last, with various alterations, of course, until the 19th century. No, I'm running too fast here. So the advent of the Crusades will bring back life to the city, which will witness a revival of its commercial activity and a massive fortification campaign, including consolidation of the city walls and the erection of a fortress and other defensive works, mainly the harbor and in the surrounding neighborhood. The Mamluk city that followed continued to function also as a commercial outlet, and in the Ottoman and last and in the Ottoman period, so in the 19th century, the landscape of the city progressively changed due to a shift of its role from a marginal one to an important regional one, until its final extension outside the ancient boundaries, as you can see. Now, of course, I'm aware this insight into the city evolution still needs to be dealt with more thoroughly and needs to be more nuanced. Okay, electricity is off within every single period. Just a second, please. Especially concerning the Hellenistic and Roman periods, taking into account every single find retrieved from Beirut rich underground. I have tried my best to accomplish this task, but didn't completely succeed, as another unfortunate recent and terrible earthquake shook my working plans. On another hand, it was beyond the scope of this presentation, of course, to go further into the discussion of the urban landscape of every single period, as the subject is so infinitely rich, as you can see. It must be noted that many promised and eagerly awaited for publications should come to light in the near future and will probably bring their share of new information, which will certainly help in better understanding the city of Beirut, and hence shed light on the role it played during each of its occupation phases and long existence. Finally, I hope this modest synthesis and contribution will help, on one hand, preserving the few surviving remains, and on the other hand, will encourage and stimulate others to pursue the in-depth study of this highly fascinating and for some beloved Levantine city. Thank you for your time and your patience.
Wow, thank you very much, Patricia. You have been, I think, too humble. You said a modest synthesis. I wouldn't call it actually that way. To me, it looked like absolutely a breathtaking overview of the city, and I loved it. Actually, I have to say that it's been like a biography of one of the greatest city of the Eastern Mediterranean. So for me, was absolutely a great presentation, a great lecture. And so I thank you again for your work. I stop now the recording of the conference.